When we think about fixing something that's fundamentally broken, say you've got a leaking high-pressure water pipe, right? And it's buried deep under your floorboards. The logical approach is to get right down to the source of the problem. You shut off the main water valve, you tear up the floor, you replace the cracked fitting, and you basically do the hard, disruptive structural work so the system can actually function the way it was engineered to.
Which is, I mean, that's the ideal scenario, right? Assuming you actually have the time, the tools, and honestly, the emotional capacity to handle tearing up your own floorboards. But human psychology rarely operates on ideal scenarios.
Right, exactly. What actually happens is that instead of fixing the pipe, you just slap a piece of heavy-duty duct tape over the crack, and it holds for a day. But then tomorrow, the water pressure builds, the crack splinters a little further and starts leaking again.
So you add another layer.
Yeah, you add another layer of tape, and you keep doing this day after day, decade after decade, and eventually you don't even have a pipe anymore. You just have this massive, swollen, heavy ball of tape desperately holding back an absolute flood.
That's such a, wow. That is an incredibly visceral way to picture it. And it perfectly encapsulates what so many of us are actively doing to our own nervous systems, like every single day.
Yeah.
We are navigating incredibly complex modern lives, functioning almost entirely on emotional duct tape. We use whatever we can find to patch the leaks just to get through the next 24 hours.
And that heavy, suffocating ball of emotional duct tape is exactly what we are unpacking for you today. So to you, the learner listening right now, we have a truly fascinating stack of sources to dive into. We're looking at the highly unfiltered, deeply personal diaries of a 58-year-old Army veteran who, quite suddenly, decided to rip the tape off and quit a 45-year drinking habit.
45 years. It's staggering.
It really is. But the thing is, this isn't just a memoir about sobriety. Alongside his diaries, we have deep neurological breakdowns of how dopamine loops hijack our prefrontal cortex, some really stark data on the biological fallout of industrial agriculture, and then...
And this is the part that seems totally out of left field, right?
Oh, completely out of nowhere. Incredibly detailed culinary techniques for things like wet brining poultry and lacto-fermenting cabbage.
Right. On the surface, the material looks wildly disjointed.
Yeah.
You got a veteran struggled with addiction sitting right next to environmental data about Welsh rivers and, recipes for bone broth. But there is a profound unifying thread weaving through all of this.
Which brings us to the mission for today.
Exactly. Our overarching mission for this deep dive is to examine the sheer mechanics of a hijacked nervous system. We're using this one man's midlife systemic reset as a lens to look at how our environments, so both the digital landscapes we stare at and the physical systems producing our food, how they are literally engineering chronic stress into our biology.
So we're going to explore why relying on white-knuckle willpower is biologically doomed to fail, how the dry drunk syndrome proved that removing a bad habit doesn't actually heal the underlying trauma, and what happens when we swap a liquid coping mechanism for a digital one.
Because the brain always wants a replacement.
Always. But more importantly, we are going to look at the radical physiological tools required to rewire our minds and bodies. And spoiler alert, one of those tools involves plunging your face into freezing cold water to trigger an ancient neurological circuit breaker.
It is a complete roadmap from avoiding reality to actively structurally rebuilding it. And I think the most compelling place to start is right where the source material begins. It doesn't open with this cinematic falling down drunk rock bottom.
No, not at all.
Right. It opens with the quiet, functional, socially acceptable coping mechanisms that slowly encapsulate us over decades.
Yeah, looking at this guy's diaries, the sheer duration of the habit is staggering. He drank for 4.5 decades. But he completely shatters the stereotype society usually associates with the word addiction.
Yeah, he really does.
He wasn't the chaotic guy sleeping in the gutter. He was a highly capable ex-military man. He held down a demanding job in IT, paid his mortgage, showed up to family events, cracked jokes at the local pub, and even coached others. He wasn't drinking to party. He was using alcohol as a volume control for his own internal static.
And that right there is the insidious nature of what the sources refer to as hidden drinking. This phenomenon rarely involves public intoxication or dramatic interventions.
It's way more subtle than that.
Exactly. It's about the quiet, persistent, exhausting management of a dependency behind closed doors. The diaries describe the meticulous, daily mental gymnastics required to maintain the illusion of control.
The sensory details he includes are honestly heartbreaking. He talks about the specific way he would bury glass bottles at the very bottom of the recycling bin so the neighbors wouldn't hear the clinking sound.
Wow.
And he describes the ritual of checking his breath in the hallway mirror, like chewing intensely strong mints just seconds before his partner walks into the room. It's the reality of living two completely fractured lives. You have the capable, stoic public persona and the private self who feels fundamentally incapable of surviving a Tuesday evening without a chemical off switch.
And the cognitive load of maintaining those two lives is staggering. You're constantly monitoring your own behavior, tracking who saw you drink what, calculating when you can get your next drink without raising suspicion. It's exhausting.
Just constantly doing math in your head.
Right. And to explain exactly what is happening in the brain during this exhausting cycle, the author introduces this brilliant psychological framework for understanding cravings. He calls it the two Bobs.
I found the two Bobs model totally reframes the entire concept of self-control. It moves the conversation away from like a moral failing and into pure neurobiology. So Bob 1. The sources call him the addictive voice. But what's terrifying about Bob 1 is that he sounds exactly like you.
Yes, because Bob 1 is the manifestation of your hijacked prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain responsible for logic, planning, and executive function.
The rational part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when the brain is dependent on a coping mechanism, that logic gets weaponized. Bob 1 is the smooth, rationalizing voice that pipes up at 4 p.m. on a Friday.
Oh, I know that voice. Bob 1 says, hey, you've had a brutal week at work. You handled that client crisis perfectly. You're a responsible adult. You've got this totally under control. Go on, you deserve a treat. Just one drink to take the edge off.
Right, just one.
Bob 1 disguises the addiction as your own perfectly reasonable, well-earned logic.
And because Bob 1 uses your own internal monologue, you don't even realize you're being manipulated. But Bob 1 is only half the equation. Then you're Bob 2.
Ah, yes, Bob 2.
The author refers to Bob 2 as the Chimp, which draws heavily on the well-known Chimp paradox psychological model. Bob 2 doesn't use logic. Bob 2 doesn't use words at all. Bob 2 is your limbic system.
So the ancient reactive nervous system?
Exactly. It operates purely on survival autopilot.
The sources describe Bob 2 as an unsupervised toddler who has just chugged a massive energy drink.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. It operates entirely on impulse. It just wants immediate dopamine, whether that's booze, processed sugar, internet porn, endless scrolling, and it wants it right now. It has absolutely zero capacity to care about the long-term consequences. It doesn't care about your health, your marriage, or your bank account. It just wants the chemical hit.
And when you look at why human beings fail so spectacularly when they try to break a bad habit, it all comes down to the friction between the two Bobs and our culturally ingrained reliance on willpower.
Which we're always told is the answer, right? Just use willpower.
Right, but the author points out a biological reality here. Willpower is a finite resource. It is a form of cognitive effort, specifically known as ego depletion.
And effort inevitably collapses under pressure.
Inevitably. When your nervous system is heavily taxed by external factors, like a stressful meeting, poor sleep, financial anxiety, or just the accumulated friction of a long day, your prefrontal cortex becomes fatigued. Your willpower degrades.
You just run out of gas.
Exactly. And at that exact moment, the brain defaults to the path of least resistance. It reaches for whatever soothing mechanism it knows best. Bob 2 screams for the immediate chemical relief, throwing a biological temper tantrum. And Bob 1 smoothly steps in to provide the intellectual excuse to give in.
But here's where I really had to stop and push back on the material while I was reading it. If Bob 1 sounds exactly like my own internal voice, how am I supposed to fight it? If the voice telling me to pour a drink or open social media sounds like me, isn't the act of telling myself no the very definition of willpower?
Which we just established doesn't work.
Right, we just established that willpower fails.
Right.
So how do you break the loop?
That is the million-dollar question in addiction and behavioral psychology. And it brings us to a specific technique the sources highlight, called the emotional observation method, or EOM. The counterintuitive secret of EOM is that you do not fight the voice.
Which goes against everything we're taught. We're taught to battle our demons.
Right. But the neuroscience shows that attempting to violently suppress an urge actually triggers the amygdala.
The threat detection center.
Exactly. The classic psychological experiment is the white bear problem. If I tell you to absolutely not think about a white bear, your brain has to constantly check in to make sure you aren't thinking about a white bear, which means you are constantly thinking about it.
Oh, right, because you have to monitor the absence of the thought.
Yes. Suppressing a craving creates intense psychological resistance. It signals to your nervous system that the craving is a massive threat, which paradoxically amplifies the intensity of the urge.
It makes it stronger.
Exactly. EOM bypasses this entirely. EOM is about moving from being a hostage to the craving to becoming an objective clinical observer of it.
I was trying to picture how that works in practice for someone sitting on their couch at 8 p.m. When the urge hits, when Bob 1 starts whispering about how a drink would be nice, you don't start mentally arguing. You don't try to list all the reasons why you shouldn't drink. You drop out of your head entirely and locate the physical sensation of the urge in your physical body.
You scan your physiology. Where does the craving actually live? Does it feel like a sharp tightness in your chest? Is it a lump in your throat? Is it a hollow, restless fluttering in your gut? You find the physical sensation and you simply name it, stripping away all moral judgment.
It's a complete separation of identity from biology. Instead of sitting there thinking, I am weak, I am failing, I have a broken brain, you sit there and say, I am currently observing a sensation of heat in my chest, or I am observing a feeling of shame.
You label the machinery. You acknowledge Bob 1 by saying, I hear the addictive voice talking, but that voice is a neurological echo. It is not my core self. By doing this, you insert a microscopic gap between the stimulus, the craving, and the response, the action. You are no longer mindlessly automatically reacting. You are stepping back and watching the gears of your own mind turn.
But let's look at the reality of what happens when you actually succeed at this. Let's say you use EO. You observe the two Bobs, you ride out the craving without giving in, and you finally rip that heavy emotional duct tape right off the pipe.
Then you face the fallout.
Yeah. The diaries go deep into what the author calls the 8 brutal truths of early sobriety. And I have to tell you, it completely dismantles the pristine, glowing picture painted by modern wellness influencers.
It is a decidedly unglamorous, violently uncomfortable physiological process. The sources pull no punches here. There are no immediate green smoothies, radiant skin, and serene sunrise yoga sessions waiting for you in those first few months.
Definitely not.
When you suddenly remove a heavy-duty central nervous system depressant that has been artificially regulating your biology for 45 years, the structural fallout is immense.
Looking at his notes from those early days, the sheer mundane reality of it is shocking. The first brutal truth he highlights isn't the physical shaking, it's the boredom. He calls it weapons-grade boring.
Intense grade, yeah.
He writes about how watching Netflix, attending a dinner party, or even just sitting quietly in a chair becomes physically excruciating. Why does the absence of a liquid make normal life feel so unbearable?
It's a phenomenon rooted entirely in dopamine receptor downregulation. For 4.5 decades, his brain was subjected to massive artificial flood-level surges of dopamine every time he drank. The brain is obsessed with homeostasis.
Balance.
Balance. To protect itself from being constantly overstimulated by these chemical floods, the brain literally dials down its own natural dopamine receptors. It shrinks them or turns them off.
So the brain essentially wears earplugs to muffle the incredibly loud chemical noise.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
But when you suddenly remove the alcohol, the brain is still wearing the earplugs. The receptors are still downregulated.
Oh.
As a result, the brain's ability to perceive normal, everyday, subtle pleasure is completely broken. A quiet conversation with a friend, a beautiful sunset, or a good cup of coffee simply cannot register on receptors that have been blown out by decades of chemical fireworks. Everything feels flat, gray, and agonizingly dull.
And it takes time to fix that.
It takes months, sometimes longer, for those neuroreceptors to physically rebuild and recalibrate so that normal life can feel engaging again.
And then there is the sleep. This is the one that really surprised me. The common cultural myth is, oh, quit drinking and you'll sleep like a baby. The diaries completely shatter that. He writes about sleeping terribly, jolting awake at 3 a.m. every single night, dripping in sweat, vibrating with anxiety.
This comes down to the specific neurotransmitters alcohol manipulates, namely GABA and glutamate. GABA is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter.
The one that relaxes you.
Right, it relaxes you. Glutamate is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter. It makes you alert and anxious. Alcohol aggressively mimics GABA while simultaneously suppressing glutamate.
So it's heavily pressing the brake pedal while completely cutting the gas line.
Precisely. And to survive this daily sedation, the brain adapts. It stops producing its own natural GABA and massively ramps up its production of glutamate just to keep you awake and functioning.
So it's fighting the alcohol.
Yes. When you quit drinking, the alcohol is gone, but the brain's adaptation remains. Suddenly, you have almost no relaxing GABA, and a raging, roaring flood of excitatory glutamate. Your nervous system is redlining. That 3 a.m. wake-up is your brain chemically panicking because it is swimming in excitatory chemicals without any depressant to buffer them.
Which perfectly explains the next brutal truth, the return of the emotions. He describes it like a freight train hitting him. After 45 years of having this convenient liquid volume knob that you could just twist down whenever things got uncomfortable, the knob is completely ripped off the console.
He's feeling everything.
Everything. He talks about bursting into tears at random television adverts or feeling this surge of absolutely blinding, irrational rage just because he dropped a spanner in the garage.
He is navigating the world with a completely unbuffered nervous system. For 45 years, he hadn't actually processed grief, anger, stress, or even profound joy. He had merely sedated the physiological symptoms of those emotions.
So it's a massive backlog.
Exactly. When the anesthesia wears off, the backlog of decades of unprocessed emotional data comes rushing to the surface all at once. The nervous system doesn't know how to filter the inputs.
And while he is dealing with this internal chaos, he hits another brutal truth, the external social cost. He realizes that he has to let certain friends go, because when he gets sober, he looks around and realizes that the foundation of those friendships wasn't shared values, mutual respect, or deep connection.
It was just the alcohol.
The entire foundation was just ethanol. They had just been having the exact same repetitive conversations in the same pub for 15 years, but because their brains were flooded with dopamine and suppressed by GABA, it felt profound.
Recognizing that reality is incredibly painful, but it segues into one of the most vital psychological concepts discussed in the material: the acute danger of becoming what clinical circles call a dry drunk.
I found this concept fascinating. It's the realization that if you just remove the alcohol, if you just take away the duct tape, but you don't actually repair the cracked pipe beneath it, you haven't healed. You haven't addressed the underlying anxiety, the trauma, or the fundamental reasons why your nervous system needed to be numbed in the first place. You are just sober, white-knuckling it, and absolutely miserable.
Sobriety is widely misunderstood as the finish line. In reality, removing the substance is merely the starting line. It just clears the mental fog enough so you can finally see the broken internal machinery that is generating the pain.
The structural damage.
Right. And the author of these diaries pushes back incredibly hard against traditional recovery dogmas here, specifically taking aim at the famous phrase, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic.
Yeah, he explicitly rejects that label, calling it total bollocks, which is a bold stance considering how deeply ingrained that phrase is in recovery culture. Why does he view that label as so destructive?
He argues from a psychological standpoint that it operates as a fear-based tactic. It locks an individual into a permanent identity of fundamental brokenness. If you wake up every single day and recite the mantra that you are diseased, powerless, and always one sip away from total destruction, you force your nervous system to live in a perpetual state of hypervigilance and underlying shame.
Which is just more stress.
Exactly. He reframes his journey entirely. He doesn't view his drinking as an incurable lifelong disease. He views it as a deeply ingrained, highly automated coping mechanism that initially worked to soothe his nervous system until it adapted and started destroying him.
The analogy he uses in the diaries to describe this dry, drunk realization is just brilliant. It ties right back to our leaking pipe. He compares his 45-year habit to living in a house with a flooded basement. For decades, the alcohol functioned as a heavy-duty water pump.
Pumping out the stress.
Yeah, it was constantly chugging away, keeping the water level just low enough so the foundation didn't entirely wash away and the house didn't collapse. When he finally quit drinking, he essentially walked down into the basement and permanently turned the pump off.
But the cracks are still there.
Exactly. The cracks in the concrete walls, the underlying stress, the unhealed trauma, the modern anxieties. They were still there. The water was still pouring in. So now he is standing in an ankle-deep, flooded basement, totally sober, freezing cold, realizing for the first time that he actually has to figure out how to patch the concrete.
The pump is off, but the structural vulnerability remains. And what the neurobiological data in our sources demonstrates is that when you remove a primary coping mechanism, if you do not simultaneously address the underlying stress flooding the system, the brain will desperately hunt for a replacement pump.
Which brings us to the profound realization the author has about modern society. He ripped off the emotional duct tape of alcohol, but he found himself immediately reaching for a different kind of tape. He realized he was simply swapping a large glass bottle for a small glowing rectangle.
He traded liquid anesthesia for digital anesthesia.
The digital dopamine hijack. This is where the ancient mechanics of human addiction violently intersect with modern technological engineering.
And the sources make a critical point here that we often try to ignore. Our smartphones are not neutral pieces of communication technology.
Far from it.
Right. The applications on them are deliberately engineered utilizing the exact same behavioral psychology principles as casino slot machines. They exploit the identical neural pathways that opioids target.
Let's dig into the biological math of this dopamine loop because it explains so much about why we feel constantly exhausted. Our ancient evolutionary brains are hardwired to release dopamine as a reward for genuine, difficult effort. You track and hunt the animal, you forage for the food, you build a shelter to survive the winter, and boom, your brain hits you with a surge of earned dopamine.
Right. Earned dopamine.
It is a biological reinforcement mechanism telling your nervous system that was incredibly difficult, but it increased our chances of survival, so remember how good this feels and do it again.
That is the evolutionary baseline. Earned dopamine requires friction, effort, and time. But a hijacked brain, a brain interfacing with a smartphone, receives massive, unearned, cheap squirts of dopamine for practically zero effort.
Just a swipe of the thumb.
Exactly. Like on a post, every ping of a notification, every endless, friction-free scroll through social media or internet pornography triggers an immediate neurochemical release. The data cited in the sources is striking. An hour of mindless scrolling provides a 50% spike in dopamine above your natural baseline.
50%. But just like the liquid alcohol spike, what goes artificially up must come crashing down. You get that cheap spike while you're staring at the screen, but the moment you put the phone down, you suffer a brutal biological crash.
Your dopamine levels drop below your original baseline.
Below the baseline, it leaves you feeling restless, irritable, anxious, and completely devoid of motivation. It operates on the same downregulation principle we talked about with alcohol. It artificially raises the threshold for what your brain registers as good.
Right. The earplugs are back in.
Yes. So suddenly, reading a dense book, playing a board game with your kids, or having a nuanced conversation feels agonizingly boring because your brain is starving for the cheap, effortless fireworks it just got from a 15-second video.
And the sources brilliantly contextualize this digital escape within the broader landscape of modern life, focusing particularly on a specific crisis occurring among men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah, the midlife burnout.
The author's diaries outline 5 major compounding systemic stressors that are driving this demographic toward profound burnout, forcing them to rely on either chemical or digital sedation just to cope.
Weaving these 5 stressors together paints a really bleak but incredibly recognizable picture of midlife. You take a guy in his 40s. First, he is experiencing fading social circles. The effortless, proximity-based friendships of his 20s have dissolved into the responsibilities of family and work. Because men are rarely taught the emotional skills to actively initiate and maintain deep connections, he finds himself profoundly isolated.
Add to that isolation the second stressor, the digital comparison trap. It is no longer just the localized pressure of keeping up with the Joneses next door. He is now constantly subjected to the highly curated, filtered, mathematically optimized highlight reels of everyone he has ever met on platforms like LinkedIn and Instagram.
Breeding a persistent low-level hum of inadequacy. And while he's feeling inadequate, the third stressor hits. Crushing, inescapable financial pressure. Mortgages, childcare costs, pensions, inflation, all compounding at once in an unpredictable economy. This is layered over a deeply entrenched, archaic societal expectation that he must remain the stoic, uncomplaining provider.
Which leads directly into the fourth stressor, the career crossroads. The terrifying realization that he has spent 15 years exhausting himself climbing a corporate ladder only to discover he actively dislikes the view from the top.
But he can't leave.
No, because of the financial pressures we just mentioned. He feels completely trapped by his own obligations. He cannot afford to step off the ladder.
And finally, the fifth stressor, a complete loss of core identity. Over the decades, he has slowly morphed into a walking collection of functional titles: employee, manager, father, husband, provider. The core essence of who he actually was, his passions, his curiosities, has simply faded away under the weight of utility.
And the author makes a brilliant observation here. He says that when you see a guy in his 40s totally snap, when he loses his temper and punches a wall over something utterly trivial, like dropping a wrench or receiving a delayed text message, he isn't snapping over nothing.
He's snapping over the accumulated weight.
Yes, He is snapping because he has been silently carrying a crushing, invisible load of anxiety for a decade, and society has provided him with absolutely zero emotional tools to process it, offering him nothing but beer and banter as a release valve.
It is the perfect recipe for a quiet internal implosion. Society's relentless directive to simply man up and push through forces this demographic to swallow their emotions whole.
But the biological cost of that suppression is severe. The sources make a crucial observation about the nature of peace. The terrifying empty feeling people complain about when they finally put the phone in another room or when they stop drinking isn't actual emptiness.
It's the unbuffered nervous system again.
It is the raw, vibrating sensation of an unbuffered nervous system that simply does not know how to exist without constant external stimulation or chemical sedation.
But let's look at this from the perspective of the listener who is exhausted. Let's say you've just worked a grueling 10-hour shift. Your brain is absolute mush. Your body aches. Isn't laying on the couch and mindlessly scrolling on your phone for an hour just a harmless way to decompress? I mean, are we really equating looking at funny dog videos to a destructive, life-altering drug habit?
It is the most common justification we make, but the sources provide a critical paradigm-shifting distinction here. Mindless scrolling is not relaxation, it is anesthesia.
Anesthesia versus relaxation. That completely changes how you view a Tuesday night on the couch.
They are biologically distinct states. True relaxation is a restorative physiological state. It generally follows genuine effort. It engages the parasympathetic nervous system, allowing the body to repair tissues, consolidate memories, and rejuvenate cognitive function.
While anesthesia just numbs you.
Anesthesia merely numbs the system. When you are doom scrolling for 2 hours, you are not resting. You are actively flooding your brain with erratic, cheap dopamine spikes that leave your dopamine baseline depleted. You are essentially starving your brain of the meaningful real-world friction and challenge it evolved to crave, while simultaneously keeping your nervous system wired and alert.
So we have a complete picture of the problem. We have a brain that is completely hijacked. It is accustomed to either being heavily sedated by alcohol to handle the stress or wildly overstimulated by cheap digital dopamine to escape the boredom. We are standing ankle deep in the flooded basement. The million-dollar question is, how on earth do you break deeply ingrained automated neurological loops? Because you can't just think your way out of it, right? Boblin is too smart for that.
You absolutely cannot think your way out. As the sources emphasize, by the time your prefrontal cortex logically realizes that you shouldn't be doom scrolling at 1 a.m. or that you shouldn't pour that third glass of wine, the habit loop is already executed. The biological momentum is too strong.
So you need a physical circuit breaker.
To stop the train, you need a radical physical circuit breaker. You need something powerful enough to physically jolt the nervous system entirely out of its automated loop. And this is where the source material pivots to a fascinating, extreme physical intervention.
The author's ultimate therapy room. He doesn't go to a clinic. He goes to the freezing, fast-flowing waters of the River Usk in Wales. Cold water exposure.
The physiological math behind deliberate cold water exposure is astounding, especially when contrasted directly against the cheap dopamine dynamics of digital scrolling.
I was reading the data in the notes on this, and my jaw genuinely dropped. If staring at a smartphone for an hour gives you a 50% dopamine spike that inevitably leads to a crash, what happens to the brain when you submerge your body in freezing water?
It's massive.
It says a 2-minute cold shower or a short dip in a winter river triggers a massive 250% increase in dopamine.
And the most crucial aspect of that data is the duration and the aftermath of the spike. That 250% increase is chemically equivalent to the dopamine surge caused by cocaine. However, unlike cocaine or a smartphone, the cold water spike does not crash.
It sustains it.
It is sustained for up to 2.5 hours. Furthermore, as the dopamine naturally and slowly tapers off, it actively raises your baseline level of dopamine for the rest of the day. You are neurochemically training your brain that a massive sustained reward follows the endurance of a difficult, real-world physical challenge. You are earning the dopamine.
And it isn't just about dopamine. The author mentions that accumulating just 11 minutes a week of deliberate cold exposure, so just a couple of 2-minute showers a week, is enough to trigger profound systemic biological shifts. It actively lowers circulating cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone driving chronic systemic inflammation in the body.
Right.
It massively boosts the production of white blood cells, strengthening the immune system, and it triggers the activation of brown fat cells.
Which is a brilliant metabolic adaptation. Brown fat, unlike standard white fat, which merely stores excess calories, is packed with mitochondria. Its primary function is thermogenesis. It literally burns calories to generate heat and warm the body.
So you become a furnace.
Exactly. Regular cold exposure forces your body to develop more of this metabolically active tissue, profoundly improving insulin sensitivity and overall metabolic health. But beyond the metabolism, cold water leverages one of the most powerful ancient biological mechanisms humans possess, the mammalian dive reflex.
I was absolutely fascinated reading about the mammalian dive reflex in these notes. What blew my mind is that you don't even have to submerge your entire body in a freezing river to utilize it. Just splashing ice water on your face triggers it. How does that work mechanically?
It is an evolutionary survival switch.
Mm.
When you submerge your face, specifically targeting the area around the eyes and nose where the trigeminal nerve is located, in freezing water, those cold receptors instantly send a panic signal to the brainstem.
And the brainstem reacts.
But the brainstem responds by immediately communicating with the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve acts as the master control switch for your internal organs. It instantly forces your heart rate to drop significantly and aggressively activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest state.
Wow.
It physically overrides and halts the sympathetic fight or flight panic response in its tracks.
So if you are sitting in your living room experiencing a severe anxiety attack, or if Bob 2 is screaming with an overwhelming craving for alcohol or internet pornography, plunging your face into a bowl of ice water literally starves the panic of the biological oxygen it needs to loop.
Precisely.
Yeah.
To use a mechanistic analogy, it is not like gently trying to close glitching software programs on a frozen computer one by one. It is like throwing a heavy chemical fire blanket over a grease fire in the brain. It instantly extinguishes the physiological flare-up.
It forces a state of absolute, undeniable presence. The author writes that when you step into a river that is 8.9 degrees Celsius, it is biologically impossible to ruminate on your past regrets.
No, your body won't let you.
You cannot sit there worrying about whether you'll have enough money for your pension in 20 years. Your physical body is screaming at you that it is freezing right now. It forces the brain out of its psychological loops and back into the physical body.
It creates an entirely new neural pathway. When the craving hits, instead of the old loop of urge leading to consumption, you insert a physical fork in the road. Urge, followed by the sink, followed by cold water, which leads to clarity and choice. You reclaim your agency.
So we have established that repairing this deeply hijacked nervous system requires pristine environments, like the cold, clean rivers of Wales. But here is where the source material takes a fascinating, deeply concerning turn. What happens when the very environment we need to heal our internal biology is physically, chemically compromised itself?
This pulls our lens from the micro, the health of the individual nervous system, to the macro, the systemic contamination of our broader environment. The author notes that his sanctuaries, the River Usk and the River Wye, are under severe environmental assault.
And we want to be very clear here for the learner. We are impartially reporting the specific claims and observations detailed within our source material.
Right, absolutely.
The author documents the heavy pollution of his local rivers. He states that the local water authority, Dwysir Cymru, or Welsh Water, actively pumps raw sewage into these ecologically protected rivers during storm overflows. He describes the visceral heartbreak of going down to his natural therapy room only to find the water thick with sewage, observing that a company paying out massive executive bonuses is simultaneously polluting the free, natural medicine he relies on to stay sane.
And he further highlights the catastrophic degradation of the neighboring River Wye. The sources attribute this specific ecological collapse to industrial agricultural runoff, pointing directly at the massive concentration of intensive chicken farming operations along the riverbanks.
Oh, the chicken factories.
Yes. The material notes that the runoff of phosphorus-rich poultry manure into the water system has triggered intense algal blooms, suffocating the river ecosystem, and has led to dangerous E. coli outbreaks that force the closure of designated public bathing sites.
And this localized observation about the chicken farms on the River Wye serves as a springboard in the sources into a really deeply alarming dive into the global industrial meat machine. The sources use Smithfield Foods, which is the largest pork producer in the world, as a macro case study for how our food system operates.
The statistics provided in the source material regarding global industrial agriculture are genuinely sobering, and they center entirely around a structural reliance on pharmaceuticals. When you pack tens of thousands of animals into massive, windowless indoor facilities, forcing them to live in their own waste with terrible air quality and extreme immobility, their natural immune systems are entirely compromised.
If the industry didn't proactively pump these animals full of drugs, they would simply die from massive bacterial infections long before they ever reached slaughter weight. The numbers in the text are staggering. 73% of all medically important antibiotics sold globally are given to farm animals.
73%. And this is the crucial mechanism to understand. These antibiotics are not being used selectively to treat sick animals. They are administered continuously at low doses in the animal's feed and water. They are used as a structural load-bearing element of the industrial farming business model, specifically to promote rapid weight gain and prevent the inevitable diseases caused by the horrific living conditions.
Which creates a massive problem.
The biological consequence of saturating millions of living organisms with a constant low-level flow of antibiotics is rapid, aggressive bacterial mutation.
Superbugs.
Yes, bacteria are highly adaptable. The ones that survive this constant antibiotic exposure mutate into incredibly resilient, highly resistant strains that standard human medicines can no longer treat. These superbugs eventually escape the factory farms.
They get into the environment.
They seep into the groundwater through massive waste lagoons, they blow out of the exhaust fans, and they wash into the river systems, mirroring exactly what the author observed in the River Wye. The sources cite terrifying projections from health organizations, estimating that by the year 2050, antimicrobial-resistant infections could cause 10 million human deaths annually, potentially surpassing cancer as a leading cause of global mortality.
That is a terrifying macro consequence. But the material also zeroes in on the direct, microscopic, biological cost to the consumer who eats this meat. It brings a very dark, literal meaning to the old phrase, "you are what you eat." Because the text argues that you aren't just eating protein, you are eating the chemical record of what that food experienced.
It is the biological reality of consuming chronic stress. When animals live their entire brief lives in extreme, unnatural confinement, they exist in a permanent state of severe physiological distress. Their nervous systems are locked in the exact same fight-or-flight panic response we discussed earlier. Their bodies are constantly flooded with stress hormones.
Cortisol and adrenaline.
Exactly. And those hormones, along with the lingering metabolites of the pharmaceuticals, do not miraculously evaporate the moment the animal is slaughtered. They are deposited and stored directly deep within the muscle tissue.
So you're eating it.
Therefore, when you consume highly processed, industrially farmed meat, you are not just eating calories. You are quite literally ingesting and introducing highly concentrated stress hormones, antibiotic residues, and inflammatory markers directly into your own delicate gut microbiome.
If we pull back and connect all the dots here, the picture is incredible. Just as our brains and our prefrontal cortexes are being hijacked by the cheap, engineered, unearned dopamine of our smartphones, our physical bodies, our gut biomes, and our cellular health are being hijacked by the cheap, engineered, stress-flooded meat of the industrial food system.
We are being assaulted on both fronts.
Both of these massive modern systems are actively fueling chronic systemic inflammation inside of us.
It is an endless compounding cycle of internal and external stress, and understanding the scale of these systems naturally leads to a profound feeling of powerlessness.
Which is exactly what I felt reading it. You look at the author. He is trying to find simple peace in a local river. But that river is actively being polluted by the very water monopolies and agricultural conglomerates that are simultaneously poisoning the global food supply with superbugs and cortisol. If the entire system is this comprehensively structurally broken, how on earth does a single exhausted person fight back on a random Tuesday night when they're just trying to feed their family?
It is very easy to succumb to nihilism when faced with systemic issues. However, the author provides a deeply grounded, highly practical, and localized solution. He advocates passionately for the concept of food sovereignty.
Food sovereignty.
You cannot dismantle global agricultural monopolies overnight, but you absolutely have agency over what crosses the threshold of your lips and enters your bloodstream. He suggests stepping completely out of the industrial model by fundamentally changing consumption habits. Buying significantly less meat overall, but ensuring that the meat you do consume is from high welfare, pasture-raised, or outdoor-reared sources where the animal actually experienced a natural life.
And what I loved is that he doesn't just preach this philosophy, he backs it up with actual tactile culinary skills to make that transition viable and affordable. We get these surprisingly deep chemical explanations of recipes in the diaries. He frames cooking not as a chore, but as an act of biological self-defense.
I love that framing.
For example, he talks about making his own chicken bone broth to heal a gut lining destroyed by years of alcohol and stress. He takes a leftover high welfare carcass, throws it in a pot with filtered water, rough chopped garlic, onions, and carrots, and simmers it on low heat for 4 hours. But he notes one very specific, crucial chemical trigger. He adds 2 capfuls of raw apple cider vinegar to the cold water before turning on the heat.
That is a vital step in the extraction mechanism. Bone broth is only healing if it contains the nutrients locked inside the bones. The mild acidity of the apple cider vinegar actively works to break down and draw the deep minerals, the collagen, and the gelatin out of the connective tissue in the marrow, releasing them into the liquid over those 4 hours.
So it's basically chemistry.
Yes. The result is a highly bioavailable, nutrient-dense matrix that actively repairs the mucosal lining of the intestines.
He also breaks down a shockingly simple, ancient recipe for homemade sauerkraut. It is literally just 3 ingredients: shredded cabbage, a specific weight of salt, and some caraway seeds.
But the mechanism of preparation is what transforms it from a salad into medicine. He chops the cabbage, adds the salt, and uses a wooden pounder to aggressively agitate and crush the cabbage. The salt chemically draws the natural water out of the plant's cell walls, creating its own brine.
Which is so cool to watch happen.
It is. You then pack the crushed cabbage incredibly tightly into a glass jar, ensuring it is completely submerged under its own liquid, which forces the oxygen out.
Yeah.
And this creates a purely anaerobic environment.
And that anaerobic environment is the key.
It is. The natural lactobacillus bacteria that inherently live on the surface of cabbage leaves thrive in salty, oxygen-free environments, while harmful rotting bacteria die off. This triggers lactofermentation. The good bacteria consume the natural sugars in the cabbage and excrete lactic acid, which preserves the food.
And it feeds your gut.
More importantly, consuming this fermented cabbage introduces massive, diverse colonies of live probiotics into your digestive tract. These bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, specifically butyrate, which directly lowers internal inflammation and strengthens the gut-brain axis.
He even gives a brilliantly simple tip on how to make cheaper, leaner cuts of meat taste incredible without having to rely on the chemical tenderizers or artificial flavorings pumped into processed food. He uses a technique called wet brining. He dissolves precisely 600 grams of salt into 10 liters of water, creating a very specific 6% saline solution, and submerges a whole chicken or a turkey in it overnight, adding crushed garlic and cinnamon sticks.
Which is pure kitchen science.
He explains the biology of why this works. The salt actively denatures and unwinds the tightly coiled protein structures inside the muscle fibers. This microscopic unwinding creates tiny pockets that trap water, allowing the meat to absorb and hold on to significantly more moisture. When you roast it the next day, it stays incredibly succulent instead of drying out.
These are not just recipes. They are ancient, fundamental methods of nutritional preparation. They are ways of reclaiming agency from an industrial food system that values shelf life and profit over human biology. It is about returning to a state of visceral connection, where you understand the exact chemical processes fueling the cells of your body.
So, if we look at the journey so far, we have talked about recognizing the 2 bobs and peeling off the heavy emotional duct tape of addiction. We've explored breaking the deeply entrenched physical dopamine loops by using the shock of cold water. And we looked at healing the cellular damage in the gut by aggressively rejecting industrial food. But repairing the physical biology is really only half the battle.
Right, there's the mental side.
Finally, the sources tackle the hardest part: how to rewrite the deep internal mental scripts, the underlying psychological architecture that keeps us trapped in our anxiety loops to begin with. We are moving into what the author describes as absolute mindset surgery.
The author is adamant that a true midlife reset requires a brutal, unflinchingly honest self-assessment. You cannot fix a leak if you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge there is water on the floor. To break out of entrenched psychological habits, he utilizes a highly specific cognitive framework ground from NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming. He adapts a matrix known as Cartesian coordinates to force the brain to examine a problem from every conceivable angle.
I was reading through these questions, and they are incredibly confronting. It's a 4-part matrix designed to dismantle your own excuses. Let's walk through how this actually works. The first angle of the matrix is essentially, what will happen if you do change your behavior today?
This is the angle of positive visualization. It forces your prefrontal cortex to clearly articulate the specific tangible benefits of breaking the habit. You aren't just saying, I'll be healthier. You are mapping out the reality. If I stop drinking, my REM sleep will return, my cortisol will drop, my baseline anxiety will vanish, and I will have the energy to play with my children without feeling exhausted. It establishes the psychological target.
The second angle flips it, and it hits hard. What won't happen if you do change? In other words, What do you lose by succeeding? What are the social crutches you are secretly terrified to let go of?
This requires an uncomfortable level of honesty. If you succeed in your change, you might lose your weekend drinking buddies. You might lose the easy, numbing escape hatch you rely on when your partner criticizes you. You might lose the comfortable excuse of, "I'm just hungover," that prevents you from tackling a difficult project. You have to drag these hidden fears out into the light and name them, or they will subconsciously sabotage you.
Then the matrix moves to the third angle. What will happen if you don't change? What is the real, terrifying, compounding cost of doing absolutely nothing and letting the duct tape rot?
This is where you force yourself to confront the pain trajectory. If you continue scrolling for 4 hours a night, if you continue relying on the alcohol to sleep, what fundamentally degrades? You project it forward 5, 10 years. Does your liver fail? Does your marriage finally collapse under the weight of the emotional distance? Do you lose your self-respect entirely? You have to make the consequences of inaction far more painful than the discomfort of change.
And finally, the fourth angle, which the author says is the most devastating to confront. What won't happen if you don't change? Meaning, what hard, painful truth are you secretly protecting by staying stuck in your habit?
This angle cuts straight to the core of the secondary gain of any addiction or behavioral loop. Often, a destructive habit acts as a heavy shield. Are you clinging to the drinking or the scrolling? Because if you actually get sober and clear-headed, you will be forced to confront the terrifying reality that you are deeply, fundamentally unfulfilled in your 20-year marriage. Are you avoiding the realization that you have wasted a decade in the wrong career? The addiction keeps you too chaotic to deal with the deeper structural damage.
To really lock in the revelations from this matrix, the author details a specific 5-minute future self-visualization practice. It's not just daydreaming. He guides himself to close his eyes and vividly imagine walking down a long, quiet corridor to physically meet the version of himself who is 5 years older.
The one who already fixed it.
Right, the one who has already beaten the addiction, who has already conquered the anxiety and patched the foundation. But you don't just stand there and ask this future self for advice. He visualizes literally stepping forward into that future body. He actively adopts their relaxed posture, he mimics their deep, slow breathing, he feels their grounded energy, and then he brings that biological reality back into the present moment.
In NLP, this is an exercise in profound identity shifting. He is arguing against the slow, agonizing concept of trying to change. You don't try to gradually become a non-drinker. You actively adopt the internal neurology and identity of someone who has completely moved past the need for the substance. And the material gives us a very raw, very real-world demonstration of him applying this exact emotional resilience in a high-stakes scenario.
This is the incredible story in his diaries about his interaction with the DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions in the UK. And again, to the learner, we are imparting exactly what the author details in his own notes.
Yeah.
He describes having to undergo a PIP assessment, which is a state disability benefit assessment, for a severe degenerative military back injury that he has lived with and managed for 40 years. During this grueling assessment interview, the assessor pushes him aggressively on his mental health history. The stress breaks him.
He completely breaks down.
He is literally sobbing, openly weeping as he recounts past suicidal thoughts, to the point where they have to pause the official assessment just so he can drink some water and try to compose himself.
A deeply vulnerable, traumatic exposure.
Mm.
And then, a few weeks later, he receives the official assessment outcome letter in the mail. He reads it, and the official report explicitly claims that throughout the entire interview, he was calm, completely stable, and showed absolutely no signs of distress or anxiety.
He describes it as profound institutional gaslighting, the state literally erasing his trauma on paper to deny a claim. And he backs up his anger by citing external research, making some truly horrifying claims about the system. He notes reports linking over 600 suicides to the stress of DWP assessments over a specific 3-year period, and cites surveys claiming that 61% of claimants experience active suicidal ideation solely due to the hostile nature of the process.
Now look at the historical pattern here. In the past, under the crushing weight of that kind of systemic dismissal, institutional gaslighting, and the sheer frustration of fighting a faceless bureaucracy, the author freely admits what his immediate automated response would have been. Bob Dew would have screamed.
Oh, absolutely.
He would have immediately driven to the store, bought a heavy case of beer, ordered processed junk food, and aggressively drank himself into a total stupor just to numb the blinding rage and injustice.
But he didn't. This is the moment in the diaries where all of the tools we've talked about finally synchronize. Instead of reaching for the liquid emotional duct tape to muffle the pain, he put the letter down on the table. He immediately used his breath work to engage his vagus nerve.
Breaking the panic loop.
Exactly. He utilized the cold water exposure. He sat down and meditated. He used these physical, biological tools to actively regulate his redlining nervous system so that he could formulate a strategic response rather than defaulting to a self-destructive reaction. He took that burning, volatile rage, processed it cleanly, and channeled every ounce of it into drafting a highly structured, relentless campaign, contacting his local MPs and various news organizations to demand structural accountability.
It is the ultimate, undeniable demonstration of his neurological transformation. He shifted entirely from being a passive, sedated victim reacting to his emotions to becoming a grounded, active participant commanding his reality. He notes in this section that true meditation isn't about emptying the mind to achieve some blank, monk-like state of enlightenment, which is a massive cultural misconception.
Yeah, you don't just sit there thinking of nothing.
Right. Meditation is simply the act of observing a thought flare up, like the system beat me, recognizing that the thought is just a firing synapse and not a fundamental truth, letting it go on the physical out-breath, and focusing all your remaining energy solely on controlling the controllables.
It's like performing memory surgery on yourself. You take the limiting, terrifying belief, whether it's, I am broken, I can't survive without a drink, or the system is too big to fight, and in the theater of your own mind, you actively shrink the image of it down. You drain all the vibrant, intimidating color out of it until it's just a faded black and white postcard. You take its booming, authoritative voice and you distort it into a ridiculous, squeaky little whisper, and then you just push it away into the distance. You neurologically strip the fear of its power. You take your agency back.
You are quite literally rewriting the deep code of your own biological operating system.
What an absolutely incredible, sprawling journey we have been on today. We started by looking at the deceptive, comfortable illusion of the two bobs and the heavy, exhausting emotional duct tape of high-functioning hidden drinking. We navigated the brutal biological realities of dopamine downregulation and the weapons-grade boredom of the dry drunk reality.
The flooded basement.
The flooded basement, exactly. We examined how easily we trade the liquid bottle for the glowing slot machines in our pockets to escape the 5 pressures of midlife. We explored how to forcibly reset a hijacked nervous system with the ancient shock of freezing river water. We learned how to reject the cortisol-soaked, superbud-laden industrial meat machine by reclaiming our food sovereignty through bone broth and lactofermentation. And finally, we saw how to use advanced mental frameworks to rip the tape off, patch the concrete, and literally rewrite the trajectory of our own futures.
It is an incredibly comprehensive, tactical blueprint for reclaiming human agency in a world that is increasingly automated, highly processed, and chemically stressful. And to leave you, the learner, with a final lingering thought to mull over, drawn directly from the core philosophy of these diaries. The author argues that the single most important defining moment in your entire life is the microscopic gap between a craving and an action.
That tiny gap.
It is in that tiny fraction of a second where your entire destiny pivots. If you have spent your life desperately turning up the external noise, with alcohol, with endless scrolling, with relentless busyness, or with processed food, just to avoid sitting in that gap, what might you discover about your own strength if, just for today, you stepped into that gap, stood your ground, and allowed the silence to fully speak?
That is a profoundly powerful question to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of the mind and body. Take a deep breath, control the controllables, and have a genuinely great rest of your day.